A little further, Tunde Irokari joins us this morning. He's a legal practitioner. Thank you for coming out this morning.
Good morning, thank you.
Now, to a lot of people, this a welcome development, as a matter of fact. But take us through this, because you were part of those who were consulted while this was being drafted. What's the background to this?
Well, I suppose what it is that the Civil Aviation Act obviously provides basis for the Civil Aviation Authority to regulate the aviation industry, and certainly, ultimately, the biggest reason why you have an aviation industry at all is the passengers. And so the Civil Aviation Authority obviously came up with the need to develop regulations to address a lot of the consumer issues that arise in air transportation, to protect both the airlines and the consumers. And that's why the consumer protection regulations were developed in the first place.
Okay, so at the moment, because I was even asking, because I understand it was supposed to take effect end of this month, but you say it's already in operation. I
suppose what you mean is that the Civil Aviation Authority intends to begin more aggressive enforcement, kind of letting people know that, look, these are your rights and we will enforce them. Because really the rulemaking process ends when a regulation is signed under the hand of the Director General by law, and when it's gazetted by the federal government. And so that has already happened.
What are these rights that...
Well, typically, the consumer rights are really very varied, but with respect to airline transportation, the main issues usually come from delays, cancellation, denied boarding, baggage handling, access, both airport access and aircraft access from a boarding standpoint for people with disabilities, people traveling with children, and sometimes in-flight services.
So with this, how do you call it, the regulation? With this regulation now, how would it be of benefit to the passenger? Are you sure the airline operators wouldn't want to take out their pain, so to speak, on the passengers?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the passengers are the airline's customers. The airlines generally are set up to want to please their customers, and I find that that's the case in many instances. But what needs to happen is that the regulatory authority also needs to come in there, because the airlines are set up to make profit anyway. And although they do the best they can to treat passengers in the best way they can, but you still need some kind of regulation. You need an authority that's going to look out and say, listen, this is how to treat people right, where people can go to when they're displeased. But the interesting thing is that the regulator actually stands in the middle. There are times when passengers are badly behaved, and there are times when passengers violate the law. And so the airlines also need to be protected.
Okay, so this regulation will protect both sides.
It certainly will protect both sides.
We've seen situations where operators and regulators have a face-off, that they don't know about this, or they were not carried along. Is that the case here?
Well, as far as I know, the rulemaking process, which is a matter of statute, that's what the law says, says that the Civil Aviation Authority would introduce its own regulations, and there's a process where you develop the regulations, you go into consultation with the stakeholders, not just the operators, the entire stakeholders, which includes the consumers themselves. As far as I know, that happened. There were consultations and there were adoptions, they were taken on board, and then there were revisions to the draft regulations before it ultimately became regulations.
Okay. Now, in Nigeria, issues like delays, flight cancellations, and compensations, what would this regulation cover?
It will cover all of that. It would determine what constitutes a delay, because it's internationally acceptable that there's a 15-minute window. So many
15-minute window for a delay. Was that with an announcement or without an announcement?
No, I mean, it's just general practice that there's a 15-minute window. So if you have a 9 a.m. flight, that flight departing at 9:15 would not constitute delay for the purpose of the law. Now, a lot of passengers do not know that. So The regulations will clearly identify what constitutes a delay, at what point that delay is acceptable. I mean, the first half hour, what does the airline or the operator need to do? Provide information. When it's more than 2 hours, what do they need to do? Do they need to provide you with a free method of access to communication so you can speak to someone on the other side? If it's going to be more than 4 hours, do they need to provide you with refreshment?
But you say it's already in force, it's already in operation. So
yes.
What do they need to do if there's that kind of delay?
What the airlines need to do, for instance, if there's going to be a delay immediately after the window,
that 15-minute window.
Yes, is to announce and let the passengers know that the flight is delayed. After about an hour, if it's going to be, and then they should say exactly how much time they expect the delay to be, and to the extent possible and acceptable, they should also identify the reason for the delay. Of course, there are some delays which you cannot specifically state the exact reason. So, for instance, if it's a weather delay, they should be able to say to passengers that there's going to be a delay because of the weather. And some of the delays and cancellations, which passengers would ordinarily go after airlines about, are exempted. I mean, for something like weather, the airlines, it's also in the best interest of passengers not to operate in difficult weather. So the airlines will not necessarily have liability when the basis of the delay is something that is understood to be acceptable.
Okay, moving away from delay, something I witnessed at the airport. A young man had his ticket, but according to the operators, he came in after they had closed the counter.
Right.
But by the time he came, they were selling tickets to people, but he had his own ticket and they refused to let him board.
Well, I mean, that also is a subject of regulation in the sense that the regulation, the airlines have the prerogative to say, look, this is the time of the flight, and this is the time check-in would end. This is the time the counter closes. It's only fair because they need to prepare the flight. They need to deploy their resources in different ways between arrival, departure, and ticketing. They need to close a flight, essentially. There's baggage to be moved, and then there are security issues. Going through security takes some time now, and then there's a gate closing. So the airlines do have the prerogative and absolutely the right to determine at what point, so long as it's reasonable when the counter closes. And when you've said that, if you arrive after that, then the airlines reserve the right not to check you
even when they are still selling tickets to some other people.
What I'm concerned about is the selling tickets to some other people. Well, this is tenuous. I don't know exactly what happened in that situation. But ordinarily, if the check-in counter has closed, it means that nobody else can check in on that flight. So I don't see any reason why they would be selling tickets at that point. And my question would be, if this is a revenue issue and all the airline wants to make is money, why would it not check in a passenger who has a ticket on that flight? Remember that the airline seat is a very perishable item.
Yeah.
The moment that flight departs, that ticket that is sold to you, they've lost that money. So it is in their interest. Even if they're going to charge you an extra in the future to carry you, it's still another perishable item.
But would that regulation cover that kind of scenario? Because this was a real-life incident. I was standing there. I was on another queue, and I was standing there watching this go on.
Certainly, I think it would be an unfair practice in the sense that what would have happened is if this really occurred in the manner that you've said, that was discriminatory conduct. That means that particular passenger was discriminated against in preference for some other passengers who were purchasing tickets at the time he was trying to check in. So if that occurred, yes, certainly it's conduct that should be penalized.
And this will be applicable to foreign and local airlines, both for international and domestic flights?
That is correct, so long as the flights originate or terminate in Nigeria or within Nigeria.
What about their members of staff? I mean, do they have adequate training or knowledge of all of this to ensure that they comply with these provisions?
Well, organizations understand that when the laws or the regulations change, they're going to do some internal training and all that. I suspect many of them already know this, and for those who don't, I'm sure that they would provide the appropriate training to their employees.
But I think I heard you talking about if you're at the point you're talking about providing refreshments when you're being attended to. What was that part about?
Well, what it is that after a certain, if the delay is going to be for a certain extended period of time, the airlines have an obligation to provide refreshment to the passengers.
Is it stipulated in that?
It is stipulated. It is
Wow.
stipulated.
So,
and
so
it says
so
that
the letter, details?
Yes, yes. The regulations are sufficiently detailed, and then after a certain, I mean, if it's going to be a 6-hour wait, they have an obligation to provide a rest area or, I mean, hotel accommodation, especially in the case of cancellations or delays that are going to be very extended.
Don't you think that some of these airlines might say or be of the opinion that, isn't this telling us how to run our business?
But that's exactly what regulations are about, tell you how to operate your business. Yeah, I mean, and they're very important. In any case, the way they operate their business now is based on regulation. Who can be a captain is not entirely up to them, it's by regulation. Whether that captain, whether the pilot has a license, who can even be in the cabin as a member of your crew. There are regulations about heights and all kinds of things. So, I mean, the airlines are very used to I suppose aviation is actually one of the most regulated industries in the world. But a consumer protection regulation, we must understand that it's actually a great thing. Oh. I come from the consumer rights advocacy constituency, okay. And I give the Civil Aviation Authority and the aviation authorities an incredible amount of credit for developing these regulations and staying the focus and the commitment to enforcing them.
So this also talks about how they need to conduct themselves even when the flight is airborne.
Certainly. I mean, if a passenger is displeased with the quality of the service while in flight, it's a subject of regulation. For instance, I mean, if you pick passengers up and then you treat them in a discourteous manner, and they have a right to complain about that. And there are provisions in the regulations that will consider that. But remember then, but it's not, I mean, the regulations protect everybody. The way it is that where there are no regulations, everything is very subjective. Yeah. And so passengers can pursue airlines for literally anything. But the regulations really identify what really becomes a violation of the law, in which case passengers are protected and airlines are also protected.
But from the look of things now, you know, yes, we make some of these laws, but there's always a big question mark: enforcement. Don't you see a challenge with enforcement of this?
Well, enforcement of laws is a worldwide challenge. I think it's so much more so in Nigeria than it is in many other parts, but enforcement is always a question everywhere. And that's why I think and I've been monitoring this quite a bit, that there is a campaign to bring these regulations right there to the front burner so the airlines know the enforcement will start. And so the passengers also recognize their rights. Just that whole awareness itself is an enforcement initiative, because when people know their rights, you're halfway to ensuring that those rights are respected.
Are they going to set up a new enforcement board, or is the same ones that exist? Because the same ones that exist, you know, there was always this question of confidence that passengers have in them, because they complained severally, nothing was done.
Well, I mean, the Civil Aviation Authority has a Consumer Protection Directorate. I know that they're doing an incredible amount of work with respect to enforcement, and I know that there's been recent hiring and training that's ongoing, which we have participated in, to ensure that they have a robust enforcement program. So
they will be the ones enforcing this?
For the most part, they expect the airlines to resolve the complaints that passengers have. So it's not, I mean, it's not like the airlines are removed. The airlines themselves really want to respond as best as they can. The biggest part of this is letting them understand that there's a regulatory framework and there's a violation of law when this happens. So I expect that most people will still complain to the airline and have a lot of their complaints resolved at that point. But what cannot be resolved between the airline and the passenger, I expect that the Civil Aviation Authority will take that on and certainly pursue the enforcement.
Okay, would there be any such thing as the time limits with which they have to attend to some of these complaints?
Oh, without question. What would happen is that if the complaint if ultimately an unresolved complaint comes to the Civil Aviation Authority, they would obviously contact the airline and say, here's what the complaint is. We require a response within, maybe 7 days. And then after that, they would make a decision one way or the other what their thoughts are. I suspect most of the decisions would also be having the both of them talk and see if there's some kind of a middle ground. And where there's no middle ground, the Civil Aviation Authority would certainly impose whatever appropriate penalty